thrive. Everyone, please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to our guest, Katie Beacham.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Business can and should be a force for good, and I strongly believe that your workplace can be an opportunity to engage in causes that you're passionate about and pursue issues and purpose that's meaningful to you. If you're here today, you might be thinking from one of three lenses. The first is, okay, as I'm going through the recruitment process, I want to make sure that I work for a responsible company. I want to make sure they do the right thing. How do I know that? Or how do I get engaged once I get there, right? The second might be you're interested in a career like mine in corporate social responsibility. And how do you find that? Because it's a little bit different than searching for a finance job or an IT job, because it's called a million different things and it lives in different departments. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then thirdly, some of you might either be in a social sector career or considering a social entrepreneurship kind of role. And in that case, you might want to understand how to engage with companies and get them to support you. So again, understanding how to navigate companies and firms might be helpful to you. I'm going to speak mainly through that first lens about as you're going through the recruiting process, and once you get into an organization, how do you navigate it to get engaged, and how do you know that your company is doing the right things, doing the things they should. For the others, if you're thinking through a social sector job, or if you'd like a career in corporate social responsibility, I'll touch on that a little bit, but I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A period as well. So if you would indulge me, think about one thing that you expect of a company or any private sector organization that doesn't have to do with revenue, profits, or stock price. Think of one thing. And if you need to write it down to remember it for the next hour, please do. Okay, so keep that in mind as we're talking. This is not a test. I'm not going to ask you what you think, what you wrote down, but I do want you to think about that. And as we go through the next several minutes and talk about how companies think about this, see if we check off the box of your topic, and if not, we can talk about that during the Q&A. So again, my name is Katie Beacham, and it's my honor to lead social impact and sustainability at Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton. We are a global law firm. We do focus, or primarily, a lot of our work is in intellectual property, so trademarks and patents. We have a lot of tech folks that either were in technology, were in engineering, and then went on to law school, or serve as experts for us. We also do corporate law, so corporate real estate, corporate finance, and we have a litigation department. Where is my clicker? Before I got into corporate social impact, I was very involved in my company. My first opportunity managing teams was leading a huge volunteer project. My first opportunity presenting to a group of executives was a pro bono project that we did for the state of Georgia and the governor. I learned a lot through community engagement at my company, learned a lot about greening my own footprint, how to make a difference, developed my passion for education and workforce development through volunteer opportunities, and then parlayed that into a career later on. But it was some of those lessons that really helped to build my skills and helped me feel really satisfied with where I was working. And in fact, that's why I wanted to go do it full time. But that's a little bit of a different story. But you can pursue causes you care about regardless of where you are in the organization. And so let's talk about that a little bit. Step number one is to know your why. What is your personal mission statement? What are you passionate about? What cause or what expectation of your company do you have that you want to get involved in? And then dig into that and really understand the problem. I know that there's an undergrad class here at Tech called Ideas to Serve, where they really investigate the problem, not the solution. So before you jump to conclusions about what a solution is and how you can best help or the right thing for your company to do, make sure that you really understand the challenge and the problem. Don't make assumptions. Walk in someone else's shoes and think about how to really dig into what that issue is versus, jumping to the right thing right away. It's always more complex than you assume right off the bat. The example I always like to give with that is when you think about disaster relief. People are asking you for money, right? But you've got blankets at home, and you've got, gently used socks, and you've got, toys for the kids and all that kind of stuff. But when everybody just starts sending stuff to a disaster area, it creates a second disaster. The stuff that you send needs to be sorted. They need to figure out where it goes. It needs to be transported to the right people. It takes up, are you agreeing? It takes up warehouse space that might be needed for the supplies they want to buy. And it may or may not be stuff that's needed. So that's just one example of really understanding a problem and what an appropriate solution is before you just dive in. Second, I would encourage you to learn what's important to your organization's industry, and therefore you'll understand a little bit more about what's important to your organization. Different industries have different social responsibilities. If you think of an oil and gas company, the things they need to do the right thing are very different than a technology company or a law firm, for example. There are a lot of common things that we can expect from companies in general. But industry gives you an indication of what are some of the things that we need to consider. So why do companies do this? Why, besides the fact that we expect them to, what is the company's perspective in why they're pursuing a social impact initiative, where they're going big, in a program, or as they think about the sustainability side and climate change? They're doing it for a multitude of reasons. First, of course, it's the right thing to do, make a difference. Companies have something to offer, right? The things that they get paid for by their customers and clients are valuable to the social sector and are valuable to serving people in need. There is also, a whole new set of industries that revolve around products and services that have a direct impact as well, right? And thinking about it from that lens is pretty new in the last several years and will continue to grow. Then there's the business value side of it. So companies are not in business to be philanthropic, right? I mean, it'd be nice, but companies are in business to provide a service, get paid for that service, support their employees, continue to grow their employees, to expand their client relationships and all. And that's where the business value side of social impact and sustainability comes in. And to some people that feels a little uncomfortable or a little dirty, but that's my license to operate, right? If we are doing the right thing and supporting the communities where we are, but if we're also developing client relationships through that, maybe we serve on boards together, maybe we, for example, last week we worked with one of our Silicon Valley clients on a STEM project. So during a social event, we also did some volunteering about a cause that we have in common, that we care about in common. The business value can also come down to brand and reputation, right? And that's something to be aware of and to be careful about. How is the company talking about it? Is it genuine? Is it authentic? Is it a story that has impact behind it? Or is the story leading the impact? I think there is huge value in leveraging social impact and sustainability from a business and reputation standpoint. It is a positive spot, but it can also be used for crisis PR management. And so just, as an astute consumer, as you're going through your recruiting process, think about why is a company talking about what they're doing, and is it authentic? Is it meaningful? is it appropriate? And then the last point that I would lead you to from a business value perspective, thinking about the value to employees. It attracts people to come work for that company. Through volunteering, through pro bono and other programs, it can engage you and help you grow your skills. And then, if it creates pride and goodwill for the company, it might keep you around longer. So there's a variety of different ways they're thinking about it from an employee perspective. So the different programs and initiatives that companies focus on looks different at different companies. And on the slide here is just a variety of different types of programs and initiatives you might see. There's philanthropy, donations and grants, which also can include things like dollars for doers. So if you volunteer a certain number of hours, the company might make a donation to the nonprofit you volunteer with. Perhaps there's a matching campaign for your donations, that kind of thing. That would fall in the philanthropy side. In-kind donations comes through things like donating product, providing conference room space or event space, providing, donating furniture when you're renovating the office, that kind of thing. So in-kind looks very different at different companies. Food and beverage companies would be donating their product in kind. We, for example, host a lot of events in our office space. For my industry, for the legal industry, pro bono is a huge piece of the puzzle of what we're doing to give back in the community, right? Lawyers are working on everything from helping nonprofits think through contracts and get agreements where they need to be, to supporting criminal justice cases, supporting people who otherwise wouldn't have access to counsel and legal aid, and from that kind of perspective. Pro bono can also look different in other industries. So at Deloitte, pro bono is about the kinds of activities and projects that the firm does for clients. They also can provide for non-paying clients, such as a nonprofit who might not be able to afford their services or discounted rates, that kind of thing. So pro bono, in this sense, would mean whatever skill or service that you provide to paying clients, you can also provide at a discount or pro bono. Other things that companies, get engaged in, of course, volunteering and other opportunities for, employees to engage, cause marketing campaigns, nonprofit board service. Those are more kind of outward giving things into the community. Then you get into, something that in the past several years has become an important part of a company's social responsibility is how are they treating their employees? Whether that's benefits, pay, hours, well-being programs, are they being fair to labor internationally? No human slavery, no child labor, that kind of stuff. Are they a good employer? Are they an above-board employer? Also, you think about programs like diversity, equity, and inclusion. At my firm, it's a separate function. We work closely together, though. In some organizations, it's under the umbrella of corporate citizenship. Of course, sustainability and climate change is a huge thing right now. Companies are leading the charge in the U.S. In ways that the government has decided not to, and we'll see how that continues, to play out over the next several years. But there's a lot of discussion, at least in the financial media, about the role that companies should play. And as we'll talk about it in a minute, there's a big push towards reporting in that. How are companies reducing their footprint? How are they thinking about their supply chain and the impact of the products and services and the impact that has on other people's footprints as well. So if you were to want to volunteer or get engaged at your company, or if you are on the job hunt for a CSR kind of job, there isn't one job title. And the function is not called the same thing at different companies. This is kind of a smattering of different things it might be called. It could be corporate social responsibility, social impact. Some companies will call it, their company name for good. There's just a slew of different titles. And so this gives you just a perspective if you're looking to find that department in a company or if you're looking for a role. These are different things that the functions are called. And then it also does not live in just one department. So when you're in a finance role, you know that you're going to be in the finance department reporting up to a chief financial officer, correct? If you are in an IT role, you're probably reporting up to a CIO. For this kind of work, it can live in several different functions of the corporation. Anything from the CEO's office to a separate corporate foundation, which is a legally separate entity that is guided by certain tax laws to maintain that 501c3 status. Most common would probably be marketing or communications or HR. That's where you're going to see this most of the time, but it can show up in many different departments. And what a company focuses on also has a lot to do with who their stakeholders are. This is kind of an not all-encompassing, I won't say that. This is a common set of stakeholders, but it's going to vary depending on your industry, depending on whether you're business to business or business to consumer. It's also going to depend on if your industry is regulated, if you have to do additional government reporting, if you are a popular brand with trying to make this part of your marketing. That stakeholder profile is going to look very different than if you're a law firm, for example. This gives you a sense of where it shows up. And you'll notice that along the bottom, this gets pretty broad, right? So sometimes the government is a stakeholder, and the way you approach this really is going to matter to your local, your state, federal government, or a government of another nation. If in industries that are licensed, or heavily regulated, it could be a specific agency. Usually we're first from a social impact status. We're thinking about the communities where we have operations, where we have offices, where we might serve clients, that kind of thing, which gives you a sense of which communities might your organization be focused on. Think about where the company is headquartered. Think about where it has big operations. Think about where it has a lot of employees. Think about where it has a lot of clients. And those are the communities you're going to see a broader presence in, whether that's showing up at events and sponsoring, whether that's specific programs, maybe they're in the schools, that kind of thing, but communities where they operate, and then kind of broadens out from there. So think of that kind of as the bullseye, and then it broadens out from there. And then sometimes the general public. In the age of social media, everybody's really a stakeholder. Most companies, regardless of industry, regardless of B2B or B2C, have a social media presence. And so as one of my former bosses like to say, everyone's a reporter, right? Anything can be captured on a phone. Anything can be thrown up on social media. And therefore, the general public is a stakeholder of your community presence and the way that you show up. There is a recent, or not recent, but in the past few years, the topic of ESG reporting has become front and center for a lot of companies. How many have heard this term? So it's familiar to some of you. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. In the sense of non-financial reporting. So a lot of companies are going to have a corporate social responsibility report or an impact report or a sustainability report. the movement around ESG is in a lot of ways investor-led. So whether that's an activist investor or institutional investors in a publicly traded company, they're pushing for measurement of social impact, environmental impact, and appropriate governance of the company. What does that look like? Again, this looks different for different companies, but this is kind of a laundry list of those non-financial measures that companies are being expected to start putting out publicly. The evolution from even starting to measure some of this stuff to getting a handle on accurate measurement to then publicly disclosing it is a hard road in companies. So for example, gender ratio or pay ratio, it is a giant leap for a company to report that for the first time. So if you ask your company, let's say you're in the recruiting process, if you ask a question like that, it could be uncomfortable because they may be getting used to the idea of sharing information like that. Kind of the traditional piece that's been around for a long time is the environmental health and safety piece of this. So you think about manufacturing companies and them having to report accidents, that kind of thing. That's kind of the baseline, and it's moved much more sophisticated since then. We could do like a whole PhD course on impact measurement and what, how some of the social impact measures and kind of the community engagement stuff gets measured. It literally gets kind of complicated, and so we won't necessarily go into that today, but happy to answer different questions about it. From an environmental perspective, companies are expected to release their greenhouse gas emissions footprint or their GHG footprint. There's an organization called CDP, which used to stand for the Carbon Disclosure Project, but now goes by initials. They are your best source of looking up a company's environmental footprint. It starts with emissions. It also can go into water usage, waste usage, renewable energy, reduction targets. What's the company's strategy from an environmental perspective and all. So if you're interested in really digging into the details about a company, CDP is a really good place to go. It's a nonprofit that runs a voluntary framework for companies to report to, and several thousand companies do. And then from a governance perspective, board engagement is becoming more and more expected on topics such as community engagement, employee well-being, environmental diversity, equity, and inclusion, and on and on. Many companies have a board committee now on their board of directors, and others have a specific person who's accountable to overseeing this. So there's kind of the management side of it, and then there's the board oversight piece of it. And that continues to be more and more important. How many of y'all are familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals? I expect a lot more hands to be raised. Yeah. The thing I love about this is it's the first time that companies are talking in common about different issues they're working on. When these were announced about 5 years ago, all the different national governments agreed to it, but then companies started getting together and saying, I care about SDG number 4, which is education. What are y'all doing in education? And then starting to be able to understand what different companies were doing so that one can partner, and it's easier to find, collaborations either with other companies, with community organizations, with government agencies. But then also, it's easy to understand where the opportunities are, where there aren't people, diving in on a particular target within one of the SDGs, and where those gaps are. So that is my 30,000 feet overview of how companies are thinking about this. as you are thinking about, well, my topic may or may not be, the thing that I really care about may or may not be relevant to, the company that I'm about to start working for, the company I currently work for. Well, that's an opportunity to be a leader, right? It's an opportunity to raise your hand. Perhaps there's a volunteer council that you can get engaged with, or perhaps you can lead the charge, or perhaps there's a team that's already working on it and you can step in there as well. I like to think of social impact as a team sport. It's not really good to go it alone. Like, who are your collaborators? Who are your mentors on a particular topic? Who are the people that you can work with, to make a difference? There's also this notion that companies have a blank check, right? I wish that I could say yes to every donation request and grant request we receive. Even if they're all exactly aligned with our focus areas, there's just never enough money, right? Because the world has too many needs. And so don't just think about asking your company or your partner, if you're coming from a social sector or a social enterprise perspective, don't just ask them about the money. Think of the other resources that they have to provide. And you, as a leader in your company, think about the other things you have to provide, right? For example, volunteer time. You can give your time. You can give your skills and expertise. The same thing that the company is paying you for is valuable to some organization out there, or some social entrepreneur that would just love to have your advice, your skills, your perspective, your experience. Also, your network and your company's network. Who do you and your company know that is valuable to the cause you care about, right? Introductions, getting people on their board. For example, I recently joined another nonprofit board, and one of the expectations for the year is to introduce the organization to 10 more people or organizations that can be helpful. That's one of the expectations on me as a board member. And that's something I can provide, right, through my personal network and through my firm's network. And then also think about sharing your knowledge, right? So thought leadership. Whether that's your organization, writes on a particular topic that's a focus, or you yourself write or blog, or in some other way impart your knowledge, for the greater good. If you are going to do thought leadership yourself, I strongly encourage you to figure out who from your company needs to be okay with it, or else you're not going to want to identify yourself as, an employee of that organization. So you might need to get that, you might need to get it approved, or you just might need to separate yourself from the organization when writing. But it's something to think about. So that is my quick, speedy tour. It's a really exciting time to be doing this kind of work. It's also an exciting time to be an employee who's engaged in the causes that your company is involved in. Our communities need a lot of support. The notion of citizenship continues to grow and evolve. What does that mean as a corporate citizen? What does that mean as an individual in a corporation? What does it mean from a climate change perspective? There are a lot of opportunities for business to do good and to be a force for good, and you as an employee should be able to dive right in. So at the beginning, I asked you to think about what is one expectation of a private sector organization, or the private sector in general, that you have that's not related to a financial thing like revenue, like profits, like stocks, right? Did anybody think of something or write something down that we haven't even started to touch yet? Anybody? Okay. Well, what questions do you have? What questions can I answer? Oh, Where?
There was a question here. I think there was a point.
Who had a question? Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about sometimes when trying to resolve disasters and companies to get donations and sometimes secondary disasters occur. Has Kilpatrick Townsend ever had to deal with that on a large basis?
So I haven't been at the firm that long, so I couldn't speak to direct experience. Not that I'm aware of. We do give stuff sometimes, but we clear it with a local organization who knows what's needed, right? So blankets and gently used towels and socks might be a fantastic thing to donate. But first, it's important to understand that the organization or the community that's under a tough time, that they can actually use it. And for those of y'all who didn't hear the question, he said, in times of disaster, and going back to the example where I said about not sending stuff, he said, had we had that experience at my firm? Other questions?
Okay. Excuse me.
First off, thank you for this wonderful topic.
Thank you.
How do companies, what does the conversation look like when companies decide they want to pursue some sort of social good endeavor, but we're constantly waxing and waning with regard to regulatory issues? You regulate something, you deregulate it, depending on, for instance, what the administration looks like at the current time. Social, political pressure, what your peers are doing, because I know a lot of this has to do with peer pressure. Others in your industry are doing something, and you look at them and you think, they're a competitor, maybe we should do that too. So what, if companies expect that those influences that do propel them to pursue these things are going to wax and wane, how do they ultimately commit regardless of that?
Yeah. If you didn't hear the question, she said, as tides turn and issues wax and wane and administrations change, and so the importance of issues or the need for issues might change, how do you navigate that as you're deciding what to focus on and where to engage? Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious thing I think of is the auto industry, where
Yeah.
suddenly you come down hard on them and sales of electric vehicles shoot through the roof. A new administration comes in and they decide, okay, well, we're going to loosen the emissions of our vehicles now. And the regulatory system is different from, say, companies that aren't regulated.
Yeah.
But
So an interesting thing has happened over the past couple of years in that some of the regulations, especially around, the automobile industry would be an example. As those regulations have lightened up, the automobile industry is already invested. The energy sector is already invested. So they've already made those long-term commitments to new energy sources, to, in the case of the energy sector, to more environmental cars, electric cars in the car sector. And so kind of the tipping point has already occurred in some of those big, huge investments. So you think about it, it's actually, changed the industry. In other cases, and the cool thing is, it's not necessarily, at one point regulation might have started pushing them in that direction. But now the CEOs of some of these big organizations are pounding the table for it themselves. An example of that would be when the U.S. said it was going to back out of the Paris Climate Accords. A lot of CEOs of Fortune 500 companies stood up and said, we're already committed. So we're not backing down from that. They've already made the capital investments. So they've already crossed past that tipping point. On other issues, in some regard, I'd love to be put out of business because, a person like me or the things that my firm, might work on aren't needed anymore. Ideally, that would be because we've solved an issue, although sometimes I know that kind of, the pendulum of popularity or government regulation, might be for that or whatever. But if we solve an issue and it's no longer needed, that can be an awesome thing. A lot of the things that companies are working on from a philanthropic perspective, aren't necessarily dependent on government relations, which is a good thing. But then there are some social responsibilities, right, that need that push. One of the pushes these days is consumer expectations, and another is investor activism. So in a lot of cases, it's investors that are compelling companies to measure their footprint, set environmental reduction goals or set energy reduction goals, and which creates some revolution in the business. So investor activism went up, and consumer expectations went up as some of those regulations were relaxed. And so then, if you're the company in your industry that's not doing these things, that's kind of a bad differentiator. I'm not saying that system is perfect, but we've seen that start to bridge the gap over some of the reduction in regulations over the past few years.
Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us.
Thank you.
So I had a question. So if there's a specific person or a specific team that's leading a certain philanthropic or social good initiative, and then that team or that person changes over time, how do you make sure that transition is seamless? Like if one of the people that was leading that, or the team that was leading that was really passionate about a cause, and the next person or team to come in isn't as passionate, how do you compensate for that?
Yeah, that can especially come through if the executive champion leaves the organization, or if the CEO turns over, because it's different CEOs have different priorities, right? Or if if a volunteer council, even of a variety of employees, if that starts to turn over. One of the goals as we develop strategies and as we the more strategic a program is, they're trying to entrench that in the organization. So along with saying, okay, we care about X, Y, and Z, there's a communications plan behind that. There are executive sponsors. We're also thinking about what's the succession planning of our executives so that we can start to develop that support at the next level as well. There is also the need for middle management support in this. So even if you've got the executive sponsors, which is wonderful, there are also, it's the middle managers who have to make sure the work is done and who need to make sure that they're meeting their targets and stuff. And you want me to take my company or my employees, my team members away from that to focus on this other stuff that has nothing to do with the metrics that I'm, responsible for hitting. That's where some of the challenge is too. So the strategy should include, thinking about all levels in the company and, where is our support as one of the factors as well. Yeah, because these priorities can change overnight if you don't have support, buy-in, and authenticity of people who are engaged. Yeah. Back in the back.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you have any perspective or insight on how Atlanta or Georgia is unique in this space, what the companies here are doing that's maybe a little bit special or different.
Yeah, so good question. What's unique about Atlanta? The issues that Atlanta faces are unique. So you see even how education looks in Atlanta is different than it looks in San Francisco or New York. And so I'll take a step back. There's a local, a national, and a global component to all of this. And if we say we care about these issues at the global level, we need to have flexibility at the local level, because there are things that make Atlanta unique as a company, and there are opportunities from a philanthropic standpoint, from an engagement standpoint. There's some things that are going on that are really cool in Atlanta that would fall flat in other communities because the issues are just different. So going back to the piece about knowing your why, understand it for the community that you're in is a huge part too. There are so many cool things going on in Atlanta. Where to start? I'll put that back to y'all. What do you think was something that's really cool? Because if I say one thing, then I'm not saying another thing. So what are some things that y'all think are interesting right now going on in the community? I'll tell you one that I love from the legal industry. An organization we work with is called the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation. And they have a program where they actively engage in the schools with the mindset of what does it take holistically for a student to thrive, right? It's, parents, housing, full bellies, thinking about their stress, all these things that are different from just them, putting their nose in a book. And the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation has a case manager and a lawyer in many schools around Atlanta, and then there's a partner law firm who is paired with that school, so that if the parents are experiencing housing issues, if last school year at our partner school, there's a feeder apartment complex to the school, and the landlord was going to do renovations. And he gave folks short notice that they were going to be kicked out for a certain amount of time, the week that was going to start the week before standardized testing. So these children are going to be completely uprooted before they're going to take these stressful tests that are going to determine if they're passing to the next grade, are going to determine the support their school is going to receive, and on and on. And so we worked with the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation to submit an emergency injunction so that the landlord would have to wait until after the kids got through testing in order to make their, to move them out of the apartments temporarily. That's just, it's one thing I love, and I'm a little bit close to it. It's, it happens in other cities as well, but I love what Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation is doing here in Atlanta. There are some really cool organizations that are headquartered here in Atlanta. Boys and Girls Clubs of America is headquartered here. CARE International is headquartered here. American Cancer Society. There are, several more or whatever, but to the point, there's a robust nonprofit sector. There's a robust social innovation sector, and a lot of cool stuff that's going on, from that standpoint. Other examples that you might want to highlight? Yeah, and why don't you say a little bit more about that for folks who aren't familiar?
Oh, okay, sure. There's a protective study on how much low to moderate income families are paying towards their electricity bills, and there was, I think, the fourth highest city, if I'm wrong, someone looked at the fourth highest city, or over 10% of people's income is going towards their electricity bills. So what that does is it forces people to decide if they want to put their AC on during the summer or completely on the table. Which then causes other issues like asthma, which is one of the highest reasons for students to miss school, which then has an impact on their education and the education system. So I think a lot of nonprofits advocacy have been looking into what's going on with energy equity in our state, and I think companies are now starting to pay attention to how they can impact direct or indirectly, whether that be through fundraising or donation of some sort of renewable energy to impact a very local issue.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, hi. So I was just wondering, what are the most significant factors that you think are likely going to decide if a company is going to invest in creating social impact? Is it the size of the company, or where it's headquartered, or the profits it makes, or the sector it operates in? How does it? What do you? Is there any study which throws some light? Because are there any sectors where they can make a lot of impact, but
Yeah.
so far they're not, because their business model may not necessarily need that kind of public to view them in that way. I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
So there's a concept in social impact called materiality, and it's a little bit different from a financial perspective, but it's what issues are material to our business in terms of the good we can do and the bad we need to minimize. And so companies will do what's called a materiality assessment to understand what's relevant to them. And a lot of those topics showed up in the slide on ESG, but it can even be like, for example, a technology company might be thinking about privacy and cybersecurity and things like that. In addition to from a, let's go out and give and volunteer, maybe it's STEM, right? So industry and the kind of company it is have a huge bearing on it if we're being strategic about where we can make the most meaningful impact. Also, size of the company does matter. A lot of times small organizations, because they're more nimble, can do really amazing things, the same as larger companies. Location does make a difference to the topic of Atlanta, and also where a company is headquartered, where they're headquartered, the issues in that community, other communities, local and global, can all have can weigh in. The other thing is pet projects. What do executives care about? And do executives want to hold on to that, or are they going to step back? And sometimes pet projects are amazing, right? And other times they may or may not be the most strategic. But in a role like mine, we're constantly building the business case for why we should start doing something, stop doing something, continue doing something. And I'd argue that once a company makes an investment, give it enough runway to actually show value, right? So it's not like a short-term stock price. If we're going to invest in education, or if we're going to reduce our environmental footprint, we're not going to see those returns in 6 months. We're looking at a longer runway. And so that's a consideration as well. If you've got to show faster returns, that's going to impact which issues you pick. Yeah, so there's several factors that go into it.
Okay, so thank you for being here. And you started your talk by saying, how do I know that I'm working for a company that cares about these kinds of social, environmental types of impact? So I wonder what our students who are looking for, internship opportunities or full-time job opportunities, what can they do to identify whether the companies they're applying to are authentically vested in, the cause that they claim they're interested in? So what are some of the practical things they can do to find out?
Yeah, so look for measurement. Is a company actually saying the outcomes of what they're doing? There's number of people they reach, but also what's the actual impact on that? So as you're researching a company, before you even get into the company, do they have a social impact report? Do they have a sustainability report? Or if they've got if press releases come up, are they talking about not just, hey, we did this cute thing and we've got great pictures, but also, well, what were the results of that and what are next steps? So be, kind of a discerning consumer as you read about what different organizations are involved in. And then if you're in the midst of the recruiting process, ask these questions. HR folks, and managers who are doing the recruiting love to answer questions like this. And if you stump them, well, then that's a cue that it may not be that important at that company. But ask the questions. And then once you're on board, whether it's a summer internship or a full-time role, get to know the folks like me or the folks who are your volunteer leads. If a lot of stuff is driven by volunteer council, get to know those folks and understand, where the company is engaged and try it out. Thanks.
Hi, Katie. First off, thank you so much for your time. I wanted to ask, as the Chief of Corporate Citizenship, how do you take what you do and get that into the company culture and it not just staying within one department of the company?
Yeah, the more integrated corporate citizenship, or whatever it's called, because it's called different things at different companies, the more integrated it is into the fabric of the organization, the more successful we're going to be. I probably spend at least half my time networking internally. So, I'm out in the community, I'm working with our partners, I'm in the office working with our volunteers, but I'm also continuing to engage with, senior leaders, with partners in the firm, to make sure that they're supportive, that they understand, that they're engaged as well, and constantly, refreshing the business case for why we do what we do, and going on the road with that. So it is like any kind of strategic priorities. Like if in another area of an organization, if you're going to do a strategic plan, you've got to get out and sell it internally. Yeah, and that's a never-ending process. And I've been specifically focused on social impact for over 10 years now, and I can't tell you, how many versions of the business case that I'm constantly writing and rewriting and refreshing. That's an important part of my job as a steward of this work at the company. Yeah.
So do a lot of companies report the ESG sort of stuff? And if so, is there any sort of fact checking, any sort of third party organization that checks in and says okay, they're being honest, this is actually something that they're doing?
So when companies produce a report on any part of the ESGs, there are consulting firms that would be happy to audit them. So you can pay for that additional audit, and if it's a framework like CDP, which I mentioned for greenhouse gas emissions, if it's a framework like that, you actually get credit towards your rating, because they rate you on a scale of A to F. You get credit for being audited. So you cannot get an A unless you are doing the good stuff and you're audited. So auditing is an interesting part. Plus, companies are so risk averse to putting information out publicly. So by the time it gets out in the public, it has been scrutinized by the board, by the executive committee, and anybody between me, my boss, their boss, kind of thing. So there's a high level of scrutiny, and a lot of times even the internal audit organization might be looking at it before they are willing to release it. The communications department is definitely scrutinizing every piece as well. Yeah, but you do get credit or bonus points for having an external audit of any information you put out there.
Hi, so I was wondering if, since your firm is a global firm, do you implement similar social and sustainable practices in locations outside of the U.S.? And if not, how have you adapted to different values and norms of the different societies?
Yeah, so that looks different in different organizations. At the organization I'm at now, which I've only been at for a short amount of time, in our international offices, the same standards apply. So from an environmental perspective, the standards we have for our office space and for any kind of construction build out or whatever are the same across locations, no matter what country they're in. The giving and volunteering looks different, to the point about, an issue looks very different in Atlanta versus San Francisco. Well, then that looks incredibly different in Stockholm or Beijing or, Nairobi or whatever. So there is a huge degree of where should we be funding? What should that look like in different communities? And how do we respect that community and their needs? So it's kind of a two-part thing. The standards are the same, but kind of how you apply it may be different. And then different countries have different regulations on some of this stuff too. So that's always taken into consideration. But the same goes with HR policies and financial auditing policies and all that. So you do have to be aware of where you're at. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi, Katie. So, what are some admirable approaches you see to social impact or sustainability in companies globally that you would like to emulate in your organization?
Yeah. Focus is important. So I'm not going to go into a particular initiative, but focus is important because we can make a bigger impact by going deep in something rather than, in a transformative impact, rather than doing a little bit of a lot of things, right? So you think of like an inch deep and a mile wide or going a mile deep. I think that's really important, and you see more and more companies thinking that way. The challenge of that is then you're always not thinking about somebody else's priority, but then you can also support, leaders and employees' interests and engagement through, volunteer councils, through donation matching programs, days of service, that kind of thing, if you're channeling, kind of your focus on a couple of things. The thing that I love the most, and this is a general statement, but is when organizations apply their resources and their skills in what they're good at to the cause that they're supporting, be that pro bono or in kind or thought leadership or whatever. Like, what are we good at? That's what we need to be contributing. That also kind of leads to what issues we should focus on, but that makes a bigger impact than I love getting dirty, and I love like from a volunteering perspective and kind of that hands-on day where you get to like set the computer aside and pick up tools you don't know how to use, but the problem is I don't know how to use them. So is that my best contribution? Maybe, maybe not. It's fun sometimes, but the more focused a company can be against what they're good at, the bigger difference they can make.
Okay, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Can we all give her an applause?